Right, so I think now is a good time as any to begin. So hello, everyone and all attendees, and welcome to the third webinar installment in the AASA Webinar Series on online learning. Through these series, we look at and discuss the various ways in which the new status quo has really impacted architectural education worldwide, essentially. So today we are super lucky to have a tremendous and excellent list of panelists from the world over. The first panelist and speaker we have is streaming in from London, 7 a.m., if I'm not mistaken, Frosso Pimenides from the Bartlett at University College London. Frosso is a RIBA Honorary Fellow, Sir Bannister Fletcher Lecturer in Architecture, Associate Professor and Director of the Bachelor's of Architecture course at the Bartlett, where she has taught for the last 30 years. She is passionate, stubborn, that's her words, not mine, and optimistic in believing that through the practice of architecture and education, we can achieve new ways of living and being. She has lectured, examined, practiced, and taught in various schools globally. Our second speaker is someone that I'm very, very familiar with and admire very much, Dave Pygram from UTS, a colleague of mine. Dave is a course director here at UTS, where he combines computational design and digital fabrication to achieve climate-positive design and construction transformation. You may also know Dave is also co-director of a Supermaneuver, an international award-winning architecture and innovation company. And last but certainly not least, all the way from Cape Town, we have Yolanda Morkel from the Cape Peninsula University of Technology. Yolanda is a professional architect and senior lecturer in architecture at the CPUT in South Africa. Her teaching practice and research interests are focused on learning, design thinking, and flexible online and blended design studio pedagogy. Right. So a quick rundown of today's program. We will start with this short introduction, followed by 15 minutes presentations by each of the panelists, and ending with a 15-minute Q&A session where we will address any questions or comments attendees may have. If you have any questions during the presentations, please enter them into the Q&A portal and we will answer them in the Q&A session. Should we run out of time, we will answer any remaining questions through the AASA website or via email. Finally, and similar to previous webinars, today's webinar will be recorded and uploaded to the AASA website, and we'll also send today's attendees a link of the recording once it's live. Before starting the talks, I'd like to just bring your attention to the new online learning resources page on the AASA website. In this section, you can find all the material we have created in the past few weeks, including presentations and recordings of the previous AASA webinars. We also created a new section that's fresh off the press, which serves as a repository for online learning resources, where we are collecting and distributing material that you may find useful in navigating the digital impact on our academic world. We are opening this page for contributions, and so if you have a resource that would be beneficial to share with other academics, by all means, please send us this information if it's a link through the chat or by email either to me or the AASA Secretariat, Martha Lu. Finally, just to keep in mind that we have a few more webinars coming up in the coming few weeks. So be sure to stay updated with the AASA website on how to register once this information becomes available. Righto, so without further ado, I will ask Frosso to share her screen. I will stop sharing my screen and Frosso share hers. Frosso, off to you.
Hello, everybody. Mohammed, is that correct?
Yeah, we can hear you. Fantastic. You're good to go.
Great. So good morning, everybody from London. I cannot see you, but I can feel you are there, miles away. Well, I was asked today to discuss a few points about our thoughts. What is it to actually keep the culture of architecture studio, the studio culture going in this online teaching scenario we were all pushed in. So I will rephrase that to say a question of how, in other words, from a collective existence, a daily collective existence, all of a sudden we turn into a solitary existence of stillness, of a mind space on our own. And it's amazing how the resilience of human nature allows us to do that. So I need to, yeah, just 1 second. Sorry, I'm just trying to. It doesn't seem to start, Mohammed.
Can you perhaps just slide the screen, like swipe the screen to go to the next slide?
Oh, sorry, it goes downwards. Sorry.
There you go. No worries. Perfect.
Yeah, sorry. So yeah, that swap from collective existence to individual, it's sort of a great shock to the system for all of us. Just to tell you who I am, I'm an architect. I started by practicing. I got into teaching after I practiced a few years, and started with diploma, with degree, and I ended up in, I settled in first year. And why's the question? Because I love the idea of collective. I like to teach a whole collective group of a shared studio. And I love the idea of getting fresh kids who have no presupposition, no preconceptions, and deal with fresh mind and how you can convert all these kids within 9 months into imaginative thinkers and designers, and also sharing with them through the collective studio culture these sublime or tragic moments of desperation or pleasure along the path of building up our academic family and designing pretty sophisticated things without them knowing by the end of the 9 months. So I thought it would be nice to share. What you see here is samples of the old life. So today I would like to focus the pre-life, which is the normal studio. And what do we mean? Why is studio culture important? And what are the components roughly? So as a complete telex, I'll point you into a few things, and then go into the transitory moment when we had to swap overnight, and then mainly talk about what you asked me to talk at the end. So what we see here is collective work of the archive in our collective office of models that have been accumulated over the last 20 plus years, and teaching spaces. And these are the final bits of work which occur along the year. And teaching, and if we take the studio as a physical space, every single element of the space, the walls, the ceiling, the corridors, the classes were all tools for learning. And here we see the provost giving a crit after a major installation thing. And this is a little window into my own past space, my office, where it's like an archive of collecting personal writings, books, models, and the daily routine of dropping in visitors and seeing the outcome of years and days of exploring and building together. The next couple of slides show not the outcome, but the daily process of why we need to be together as a first year. Why do we need to experiment with rough work and share moments of experimentation, share classes. This is a class of learning the most divine tool of an architect, which is what is a section. You know, it's sort of a sacred act of understanding something by cutting and using fruit for that. The usual crit that we all knows, and then the daily routines of early in the morning teaching in the studio together, and the divine refuge in our school, and I'm sure everywhere, of fabricating things together and using the, so in a way our studio is first year, our studio and the Be Made, our workshop, is the actual epitome of human collaboration, skills, thinking, and personality development. And this is a classic example of one student's work. Now, what is studio culture is the space. Studio culture for me, we should talk about three components: people, objects, and places. People is because, it's architecture is about understanding human race and developing an empathy and then sort of understanding of cultures and situations. So one project that I invented with my team, and that's another reason why I love First Year, because I was teaching on my own for years, and without the team we are dead. We are who we are in life of this scenario because of our collaborators. So in my team we invented the installation project that you see here, a few slides, which is a project which brings in the second month of their education in the studio everything as a taster. It's like dipping from a helicopter up above a baby into the ocean and expecting him to get a bit of taste without sinking and then having fun surviving. So it's bringing fabrication, interpretation of historic references, interpreting, building, and at the end culminating with an event which brings a lot of public, and it's sort of an anticlimax of effort, collisions, development, teamwork above all. And then usage of studios as an orthodox thing, like this Fort Cliff is erecting certain installation bits. Because we made errors, we used the machines that were not meant to be in the office. So always breaking the rules is a very healthy approach. And then the issue of the installation is a collective fabrication project, always connects to the real place. So this is here, is in East London. And then using our installation to deal with local communities and trying to see certain points that might help them survive, and doing a crit of the occasion and using the real city space as a classroom. And during the event, having musicians making fun of ourselves to assist us in the whole project. And then lastly, using the Sejan Soa Museum is an amazing resource of ideas, references, and examples. So for years we collaborated. This year we used Peter Salter's Walmer's Yard, which is what you see the actual entry. And then we took Ovid, the Roman poet Ovid, and picked up 9 poems that we interpreted for each of the Walmer Yard spaces, outdoor and indoor, and then collaborated with a young quartet of musicians that invented and picked up pieces of historic music and their own compositions, and then had a couple of concerts alongside their installations. And all that, it's very stressful in a good sense, because it brings the best, the worst, the ugliest, and all the rest of what an architect's life is about. So again, it's about action, real life, and dreaming, those 3 things. And this sense of outward looking and using the reality of the world to dream brings us into the other category. This is Venice at 5 a.m., brings us into the whole joy of going for field trips. And the field trip gives you an intimacy of, a stone leg that is more real than the flesh. And then sharing meals as normal people do when you travel, and discovering the ad hoc accidental encounters that, you meet, that this is the Roman Forum, and it's completely the opposite of what they tell you in history and in books. You go there and you feel completely cut off in a dream island, and you cannot understand that unless you are there. So the question is, all these beautiful things that is our existence, and that's the Cinecittà that we visited, we slipped into an illegal part we couldn't have been. And all this beautiful reality, how do we deal with it that we lose it? And I'll come back in a minute. And the last bit of the people is that, without people and peripheral events, the studio culture cannot stay. So imagine you're an octopus. The octopus is us, and the legs are all the outwards activities, ridiculous and serious, that enable all this community of students to exist together and alone. And this bonding and this sort of ridiculing and adoring and supporting each other and sharing is what builds up the confidence. And you see all deans of the school and all workshop managers, and my own student is one of the best teachers now around. And my first class I taught here, ages ago, 250 years minus 0, and the elders, the value of the elders on the right. You know, what do we learn from old people that are around and almost 100 and they still inspire us? And then other personalities that are inspirational in terms of teaching and designing. And this octopus of connections, it doesn't have to be this with memory. You know, we reach out people that we met a few years or yesterday or at events. And also this outward looking is sort of old director of the school ages ago and the current key member of the BIM, of the workshop in terms of, you know, his birthday, 60th birthday, that table. For me, that table, guys, is like a metaphor of the studio table where we teach every day. It's a metaphor of a city square. Where is the heart? It's the anchor. Without a table, you cannot do anything. Without a square, there is no community, there is no city. And then further outward activities with little kids that come once a month and we teach them in a day is sort of how to understand what is a city, what is architects do. And finishing this cultural old stuff, we go with the daily activities of a breakfast club that we invented, where the whole school comes every Friday for an hour, share breakfast, my students on the right serve, and then all this sort of warming up of a stop before the day starts. And from the ordinary, we go to the extraordinary events, which we can't have anymore, of course. That's the end of the year show, and everybody becomes really drunk, really silly, dances in the quad, and shares with the public. And a few glimpses into sort of prize givings and achievements. And first year, this is all first year work I'm showing you, first year exhibitions. So out of all this sort of academic family and cloud of amazing, I mean, heaven, believe it or not, or hell, all of a sudden on Friday the 13th of March, in London at least, we are told and we decide to pack everything. So you see us here with the equipment that we all had to have, try to pack all the kids and their work overnight. Now, don't forget, I'm talking about everything, but particularly our studio, which is first year. So I think the metaphor I would like to use is imagine being a musician and all your life you're trying to perform in Sydney Opera House. I've been there twice, I adore the place. It's not what the books tell you. Unless you live it in various times, you cannot understand. So imagine you're a musician, you've done a piece, they allow you to go and perform. The moment you go on stage, and the first note starts of the piece, all your life you were dreaming, there is an earthquake, or the seagulls break the windows and invade, so everything stops. Or imagine baking the best cake you can imagine, and then the electricity goes down, so you cannot bake it, you prepare it. So of course you can come and bake it. Of course you can come back and perform, but you have to wait and you have to suffer a little bit. So that's the metaphor I want to share with you. That's the last day on Friday the 13th in the studios. So after we packed, it was a final tea and coffee, and amongst cries, basically, and hugs, we had a Corona beer party, and then the next day, everything was packed, as you see, very surreal. So that being the past, how do we address the future? So I don't know who gave me that, someone sent it to me. So from the 20th of March, 2 months now, we're locked up. So there is the issue of today. How do we approach that? So the whole point is that, you know, architecture is a very collective activity. It's about sharing. It's about accidental encounters. We don't have any of that. Now, this very pessimistic drawing says that this skinny little egg will be what we achieve. But what so that's the reality now, you know, everybody from that really warm family atmosphere, academic family, extending everywhere on the screen. And then with our old, for some time retired Peter Cook, old chairman, he's locked up in his son's here. You can see the fluffy toys of his son, Alex. And then he volunteered to do these Friday lectures which is in a way became an optimistic, a sense of optimism, a sense of a focal point in a week that for the last couple of weeks, 4 weeks, every Friday we would meet from his bedroom, from our bedrooms or studies. We somehow connect Singapore, Greece, London, Oxford, whatever. So this idea of intimate, global, but yet very intimate, from, in a way, windows to our personal life, made it a very different relationship. So as architects, we are doomed because, you know, we are doomed that we are, Desmond Tutu once, I remember an amazing quote that we are all prisoners of hope. So this optimism that as architects, by the way, this is my forest, that's where I live, Northeast London. So this optimism has to keep us going because all of a sudden we asked our students to send us all the studios of where they work and colonizing their parents' rooms and a view. So everybody sent the place and the view outwards. So you've got from central London to Singapore on the right and Oxfordshire and whatever else in the country in the middle. So it is amazing, the resilience, and that's my study in terms of where I am at the moment. And out of 15 years in this house, it's the first time I look at the sunset. And how is that possible? That, you know, the intimacy of our environment and the belief then that from our loneliness, from this sort of solitude, the confinement, we can actually get some hope in the amazing, I can't remember who it is, but an amazing Australian writer gave a beautiful lecture about the power of solitude and sort of introverted and isolation from all this consumer society, and the advantage of, to build up your creativity, you need imagination, and the imagination we can achieve being alone and being free from the stupid institutions, whether it's a government or a school, that we are freed and make our own connections. So this hope I would like to finish, and we carry on later, of to build a different community, which is global, we are free, but then we need to be a bit more mature, a bit more autonomous, a bit more daring, and trust in taking risks. So I think, Mohammed, I'll stop now, and we'll carry on later.
Fantastic. Thank you, Professor. That was amazing.
So shall I, what do I do now? Tell me.
Stop sharing the screen, and I will hand over to Dave
okay.
for him to continue.
Right.
Dave, the mic is muted.
Awesome.
Great.
Great. Yeah, thanks very much, Mohammed. And thanks very much for a fantastic start to the session, Frosso. It's clear that Frosso and your students and your team believe incredibly in the power of making, as do I. And so it's really important now that we come into hopefully not the pessimistic version of the foreleg of that quite unfortunate but amazing horse, but how we start to try to figure out how we can make the most of and even find some advantages of our situation. Of course, it's not all advantages. There's no denying there's significant disadvantages, but it's incredibly important that we keep making and physical experimentation within our design studios, even as we move to delivering them online. So I'm going to give two polar opposite examples, one that we're really in the thick of right now and one which we're planning for. So the first one is first year design studio, so well in tune with Frosso, or the making component of that first year design studio. And the other one we're anticipating moving into second semester, where we would typically do a series of robotic fabrication studios and short courses. So we're planning for how we're going to deliver those through our screens. It's very similar to Bartlett. This is actually Taubman College, where I used to teach in Michigan. The UTS studios look much the same, but there's more walls, so it's less polemic, I guess. But clearly, it's incredibly important, as we've seen with Frosso's examples at the Bartlett, that we're doing the thinking, the drawing, the making, the socializing, all in one place. I think that's incredibly fundamental to what is the definition of a studio, the physical space that it runs in parallel, or really is the reason why we think about design studio. The subject is really built around this place, which clearly now has been cut up, fragmented, and sits all around the world, as we saw. We also have a number of students following our classes from China, from palatial houses with massive backyards, from balconies where you can see 180-degree views of Sydney Harbour, and then a very large number of people squashed into their bedrooms in their share house trying to saw timber. The first year studio, which we run to landscape architects and architects, we try to think of as pre-disciplinary. So really the fundamental aspects that come before the disciplines split and start to claim themselves, or the students get the chance to try to discover and define the disciplines for themselves. Our motto is that the limits of my language mean the limits of my world. And so the model is to try to expand that world by increasing the students' literal and also formal vocabulary in a whole series of ways, and making is key to that. The project I'm going to talk to you about today, this is the first project that they do, basically building an assemblage of abstract elements. It is literally an algorithmic design process, though analog in its implementation, assembling a series of pieces following sequences derived from music. And we had a funny situation. We started semester. Luckily, we had instructed students to go out and buy 3 meters of timber. That turned out to be the right estimate, although a very large number of students tried to economize and bought half as much, hoping they'd get away with it, and of course ran out at about the time that they became too scared to leave their homes or to visit to Bunnings, which is our local hardware store, or a national hardware chain. Half of the students had done their initiation and safety training on things like how to use hand saws at that stage. For the remainder, then we needed to make videos, basically. We were very lucky because we believed in trying to do the making, the thinking, and the talking in one space. We had already planned the project to make use of hand tools, not power tools, and not strongly invested in being down in the workshop. This training video was made in our workshop, but we already tried to write the project to make sure that they could be done in studio. And so that helped us when we had to translate out into our various bedrooms and so forth. But this is the kind of handsaw training via video. One of the nice things about the video is, of course, people can watch it as many times as they need to. Those people have maybe less fluent language skills, or even just in general, we limit the numbers of these training to 9 into the inductions, just simply so that everyone can see or hear, or at least that we can believe to ourselves that they can see or hear. And of course, through the video medium, then they can watch it as many times as they want. They can certainly see and hear. We can zoom in, we can edit, and we can get exactly the right content. And this is Drew here in the workshop made a really phenomenal video, because he's used to making blogs and video stories about him doing his own renovations of his wonderful historic timber sailing boat. Something that was lucky for us, but became important, was that the pieces happened to be quite small. So translating into your living room, one of the big issues for those who don't have the palatial living room and the views of Sydney Harbour is that space is a premium. And so we were lucky that it happened. We were making quite small pieces. We really made sure that everyone documented all the steps. Of course, we would have done this anyway, but it became increasingly important, because the real challenge, I think, in this sort of thing is the loss of peer-to-peer learning, or trying to figure out ways of how we maintain peer-to-peer learning. So at minimum, documenting and photographing every step along the way, how people are clamping things, what glue are they really using. Here, what we found out became a major issue was whether or not people had access to power saws. This became the kind of think everyone was jealous. We definitely saw in the background of some people's Zooms that they had home workshops with drop saws and even table saws in some cases. So really elaborate setups, which obviously allowed people to make much faster components. We had a really high number of iterations that we were asking for. And so there was an incredible amount of jealousy that came about because of the people looking at the other people with their power saws. Luckily for us, in some ways, the actual results tended to turn out better with the handsaw. And so in some ways it was a little bit equalized, but we did have to remind ourselves that we set sort of a realistic amount of expectations in terms of the number of pieces that people could realistically cut now that they'd translated into perhaps less ideal circumstances. Another thing that we noticed, because students, of course, were feeling the time demands. This is the first project they've ever done. Of course, it's a baptism of fire to go into first year and to suddenly learn just how much work is expected. This project, you might not notice immediately, but we became hyper attuned to the fact that a large number of students were placing their pieces next to each other and not gluing them in order that they could use them again and not have to recut them. Obviously, that placed a bit of a limit on the success of their iterative strategy. They wanted to only make flat things when we, of course, wanted to make them to make highly three-dimensional things. But in the first instance, people thought they were able to get away with this. On top of the inequalities of the access to more space, the access to power tools, what became incredibly important was that for us to pay attention to and to help was that all of the work was going to be mediated via photography. We could never see anything directly. That's great. It's also an important lesson for them to see that if you can curate the photography well enough, you can then tune the model to suit the medium. But it became important for us to be able to, even just really low-tech things like building homemade tripods, to try to increase the quality of the photography, making setups that compensated. We have a really fantastic photographic lab at UTS, so its absence was felt strongly, although it did provide another excuse for innovation for people to try to figure out. This is clearly just one of our examples of that people could make ad hoc photo setups that would work well. We're not making guitars or in our own projects. Things were quite successful. This is with a sheet, natural light, and a fair bit of depth of field. We were highly cognizant of trying to avoid giving people high marks for having great lenses and so forth. And we made people take photographs behind the scenes of what they were doing to see, to try to get a sense so that we could balance out. If we could see people were working under more challenging circumstances, we could take that into account. And then the other aspect of peer-to-peer learning, we adopted the platform Behance. It's Adobe's online portfolio platform. What's quite nice is it's got a social backend so people can follow each other. So this is actually one of the students' boards. I found them and then I can see who they're following. And you can see actually basically a record of all of the work of all of the students through each of the different assessment tasks. And it's very easy and fast to be able to go and look at people's work. In some ways it's better than pinning up on the wall because we have 200 students. We have enough wall space for about 2 A1 sheets per person. And obviously we want to do a lot more work than that. So there needs to be some kind of rotation. Whereas with this in the Behance, then all of the work, all of the iterations, the rejected studies, the process documentation, all of that stuff can stay online, can stay accessible, and people can go and check each other's work out. We had an interesting conversation with some of the students in a kind of focus group just this week. And it was really funny because they all know each other by name. They know who the good students are by, they say, stalking each other through the Behance platform, but they don't necessarily know what those people look like. And of course, we do have to admit that there's an absence. It's all very well to go and see someone's work, but you can't say, hey, how did you get that to stick together so well? Or how did you do those sorts of things? So there are, of course, disadvantages to this, but we're definitely going to maintain the Behance platform as this ongoing record of everything that's been done throughout the semester. And one of the nice things is, like any online portfolio, you have things of different scales, large things, small things. But as is so often the case when you're in studio, it's one of the models that was discarded on the side, that's under the table, or that's not well put together, that you actually say, hey, that was actually really interesting. Let's dig that back out. And in Behance, where everything can be put in small, the students still get to propose the things that they think are more important or less important. But we can dig back in, click on the image, get the full res. Of course, we can't pick it up and spin it around. The famous tutor that says it's better upside down, that's harder to do now. It's harder to break it in two pieces and join it in another way. But it is sort of compensated for, at least that we can get access to the original resolution, and there's no limitations on wall space. So that's the end of the first year part. The second part is robotic fabrication. So as I said, this is anticipating what we're going to do moving forward. Clearly this guy, our large KUKA KR120, is not able to be packed up and moved out of the lab. We're lucky in Australia that it seems like things are going well, and hopefully we'll be able to get at least staff back into the workshop soon. And so that will allow a certain form of kind of robot manufacture via video conference. In the meantime, we've got our two workshop technicians, or one of our design faculty and the guy who normally runs the lab, each got to have a pet robot. So they've taken it home. This is Tran. They've been working on the kind of PPE project, trying to figure out if we can contribute to the any potential shortages in protective equipment for the COVID situation. What we have always relied on heavily when we're training students to use the robots is simulation, so that they're making any of their instruction code, any of their things first gets played digitally in Rhino. We're still going to rely on that, but now instead of doing the Rhino simulation and then jumping straight onto the pendant and straight onto the real robot, then we're going to need to rely much more heavily on the second level of simulation. So this is actually looking exactly at the teaching pendant for the universal robot, and it runs the same firmware and so forth. It'll give you exactly the same set of steps. It will respond in the same way to your code. But obviously it's a bit different to being able to stand, move. We're really keen on people being hyperactive when they're running the robot, standing in the right place, that they know where the collisions are and these sorts of things. And of course we can watch in a different way when we're all in the same room. So our anticipation is that we will literally have Zoom on and we'll be filming while someone drives the robot. Or in fact, we're hoping that we can hit play remotely, but that we'll of course have someone in the room to be able to check that everything is working okay, doing these sorts of things. Where one of the things we're anticipating is a big problem. Any of you who've used Shapeways, where you've ordered a 3D print, perhaps you've been ambitious about how thin some of the parts are, and you get just a piece of powder or a bunch of independent pieces of plastic in the mail. You don't know why. You know it failed, clearly, but you're not quite sure why it failed. I think that's something that we're really keen on trying to make sure that, so these kinds of exploding elements, that we're trying to figure out ways to have people at least be watching while the failures are happening. Obviously, we're there as the kind of translators, whoever did the breaking. And then even in spite of, often we have ambitions to do very large things, one-to-one prototypes. This is a concrete tile. It turns out that we have been already, because we collaborate quite closely with some people in Aarhus, some people in Michigan. It's not an unfamiliar thing for us to put a tile like this into the post to ship it out, and so that our collaborators can get these in our hands. And we think that that's going to be our model, that we will do a little bit of a Shapeways print bureau. So the students will write the program, simulate the program in Rhino, simulate the program deliberately on the robot, its own simulation platform, watching what's happening in the teach pendant, produce the outcome. We'll record its unboxing, if you will, and then send out the results so that the people can actually get the objects in their hands and make the necessary design adjustments and so forth. So I guess in summary, making remains incredibly important. as one of those incredible expanding of our necessary language, the formal language of design. The challenges, the most important challenge I see, as we've recognized, is the peer-to-peer skill share and the kind of quality control and knowledge transfer that happens. We're trying to compensate for that through the Behance platform, through other kinds of social platforms, and our students have got very good at holding Zooms with each other. Equity is an issue, whether or not people have access to the tools, the space, and so forth. And at the moment, our way of dealing with that is making people document their setups, which we would do in any case, but so that we're aware of what challenges they're facing. Safety is an issue. Giving trainings that are very clear and coherent is one thing. Making sure people have understood it and recognizing whether or not they're working safely in their own homes is quite difficult. In fact, that's a real challenge. We have had one student go to hospital this semester using the power tools. So we had to realize that although we had made all of the training and all of the brief was written around using hand tools to try to be fair to everyone, those people who do have access to power tools are going to use them. And so we've realized an obligation to do additional training messages. Mediation becomes incredibly important. All of these things are now going to be viewed via photography. So it's important that we train our students to do that well, and that we again reveal any inequities, that some people have a much better setup in order to communicate their work through that mediated mode. Failure, I think, is one of those challenges we're trying to really figure out. So when things break and why, especially in the robotic mode where we're going to be doing the work remotely from the students, to try to make sure that we can clearly give them the most important tangible understanding of when things fail, how to react. And again, some of the advantages, I think that getting rid of the limitations of wall space by using digital means, having social platforms attached so that people can really quickly and easily navigate and see each other's work, hopefully in real time, as they start to get used to posting the progress work as much as possible. And we're enjoying the fact that no matter how large the tutorials are, everyone can see, everyone can hear. And so that's proved to be quite beneficial. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thanks, Dave. That was great. I'll ask Yolanda to switch over to, so Dave, if you can stop sharing the screen, and Yolanda will turn on her screen. Great. So Yolanda, off to you.
Thank you very much. Okay. Thank you so much for having me. I'm really excited to be here and to be part of this amazing conversation. I really enjoyed the presentation so far, and the sense that I'm getting is that linked to this whole idea of time and place that we talk about when we go into online spaces, that we also have touch, and that is often the tactile, the embodied experience that we're looking for. So the title of my presentation references Lindy Osborne and Philip Crowther's 2011 paper on the grit. The title, Butter, Paper, Sweat and Tears, the effective dimension of engaging students during the architectural critique. And I thought that it would be a good thing to bring in the aspect of touch, and to just think about how do we navigate these different spaces, and whether we're talking about online or offline, there are so many different spaces in between. So I'm going to reflect on about a decade's experimentation and experiences related to the architecture studio and the crit specifically, with my colleagues at the Cape Peninsula University of Technology, where we've had to solve different problems, not quite to the scale of a pandemic, but challenges related to students who are not able to be on campus for some other reason, in the workplace, out of town. So we've had to solve problems around proximity before. Just to show you where my empty campus is at the moment, sitting between Table Mountain on the right-hand side, the harbour on the left-hand side, the building second from the left, that is where the Department of Architectural Technology and Interior Design is situated. We are part of the biggest university in the Western Cape, with 20 full-time academic staff in our department, 450 students more or less, but the total CPUT student population is around 32,000 students spread over 6 campuses. So around 2011, we started experimenting with online design crits in the second year of the diploma. At the time, this was a practice-based experiential learning year, and the online crits were initiated to accommodate students who were unable to find work at the time in Cape Town. They had to work out of town, and they were not able to attend the weekly on-site, on-campus studio sessions. So at the time, it was really playing around with Skype, very rudimentary, using some of the Sketch plugins. We even used email, closed Facebook groups, blogs, Google Docs, whatever we could find to engage with students, to keep the conversation going, to give them feedback, and to get them to find platforms. At that point, you can imagine 2011 still, we hadn't, when social media wasn't as big yet, and we were just trying different things. So over a few years, we then had gained some experience, and eventually in 2014, we partnered with an industry partner, Open Architecture, a unit that was created by our South African Institute of Architects. And this is really where we could formalize the blended offering of a program that comprised a large component of online learning, but also on-campus block sessions that would run like workshops, and the students were employed in the offices. So we relied on desk crit-like experiences that were not only online, but would also be in the office with the mentors and employers, and it would also happen on campus. So for us, the blend was really important, that we could navigate through these different spaces. So after the pilot was concluded at the end of last year, we've now moved into a new curriculum, and Open Architecture is partnering with other universities. So it was a very successful collaboration. And in this combination of university and industry, we really found some good synergies. So I looked at the first real research on the desk crit. This reference from actually published in 1987, referencing Kasparowicz's description of the crit, and it actually looks quite familiar if you read it. What it entails. It's an informal situation. It is quite social. It happens in the studio. It's not that structured. But of course, it is not free of criticism. So there's also literature that talks about asymmetrical power relations that happen, students being stressed, students being unclear about what they should do about the feedback, etc. That's a different topic for a different meeting. But in essence, and that is a concept we're all familiar with, it's about the mastery of design expertise under the guidance of a design tutor, almost a kind of a ritual. And the big exodus, I think, or kind of mass migration that we've seen onto Zoom in the past few weeks has kind of been an interesting happening to observe, in that it was almost like the desk crit was kind of transferred into an online space. So we can start to ask ourselves questions about what is happening in that space, and how does it compare, or what are we missing in those spaces. So let's fast forward 30 years. And we can ask ourselves what has changed. Right, you might agree with me, we're seeing more students, we're seeing more diverse student groups, we see fewer design tutors in relation to student numbers. We're definitely seeing screens in the studio. We're seeing screens almost everywhere, and we're seeing a lot of them. They've almost become a part of the physical studio. We also observe in the studio space limitations, a general move of students out of the studio into computer labs. I'm so happy to see these workshop spaces that both Frossa and Dave have shown. Those are the spaces where you want students to live. But we often see students migrating into labs, computer labs as well. And then sometimes, we see the mobile phones always in arm's reach. And then we even see sometimes where paper or printing on paper falls short, that there's always a mobile phone to the rescue. So it's been also becoming increasingly difficult to access students' digital world. As a design tutor, you may well find yourself trapped at the physical desk looking into, but not quite able to reach into the student's digital workspace. I've certainly experienced that. And so we are not always in the same space, even if we're in the same physical space. And how can we mediate these different realities? The term webinar, of course, is derived from web seminar. There are many platforms, Collaborate, Zoom, Teams, Big Blue Button. They basically all work the same. You can share your screen, you can draw on the screen, you can, like we're doing now, talk, mute, you can use the text chat. And that is a basic tool. It's of course not, the interface is quite crude because you're sitting behind a keyboard and you're looking at a screen. We, in our desk crits, we avoid using the webcam, and that was basically originated from the fact that our students often have problems with bandwidth. But I've observed in the past few weeks this exhaustion that people suffer from having their webcam on the whole time and having to look into the screen. Of course, the nice thing about not using a webcam is you can focus on the work. So we focus on the student work, and you can actually teach in your pajamas. So students in our online desk crit sessions meet in groups pretty much like they would in a traditional studio. We're not seeing as much peer-to-peer conversations happening, but then we discovered those conversations aren't happening in the webinar. They're happening in different channels that the tutors are not part of. So that's wonderful. So we record our sessions. It means that students have access to the recordings. I know that's not always possible at all institutions. It depends on what the university requires and demands. So this is what my screen would look like with the students' work, and I often work with two screens so I can get the files on the one side and Google stuff and bring it into the text chat. We discovered through these experiments that we learned a few things about the desk crit, and I must qualify that because this would now be for this particular group of students, more mature students. They in the workplace. They study part-time over 2 years at the final year of the bachelor's level. We found that, of course, and Dave spoke about equity. This has become really critical now in the pandemic, where we're aiming for, especially in our context, we're aiming for low bandwidth and low data kind of options. So the webinar is not the ideal. The live synchronous engagement is quite expensive, and we must make sure that we really use it for what it's best for and use it selectively. So we've got to first decide, understand, establish where the students can connect. Otherwise, you're naturally excluding students. So it's in that respect internet reliant. You'll see on the screen a crit that we did with students from Zimbabwe when they had power outages, and you'll see the time check that was from midnight till 2 o'clock. I think the crit went on till 3. We had quite a few students in the room. It was amazing to have this connection with our students in the early hours of the morning. So that was solving that problem of time. Then we have in our crit participant invisibility, so we're not using the webcam, and some students say that it places more emphasis on the audio and that makes them a little bit more nervous, and other students just enjoy the fact that they're not being looked at. So interesting, perhaps the fact that our students are part of a blended program also means that they already know what the others look like and they've got that sense of community already. The crit, of course, is ubiquitous anywhere, any place, and you'll see at any time a student on his way from a site visit to the airport following a desk crit, not on a desk, on his lap and on his mobile. So that is also possible. The aspect around media is interesting because the biggest first question that we asked was, will our students still build models? Will they still engage with real things? And we found that they've almost craved it. The way that they present it is, it almost becomes a layering of information between the digital and the physical. Building a model, taking a photo, drawing over it in the crit, it gets recorded, the student takes a screenshot, draws over it and submits that in their design journal. So it's a fluctuation, a movement, a flux really between the different spaces. Of course, I've already mentioned that there are communication happening in on different levels, on different platforms, and concurrently, and in formal spaces, in informal spaces, in official spaces, and in personal spaces as well. The crit, in the way that we set it up, is really quite formal, and it could be linked to the fact that the students are working and they are professional and they are more mature. The crits become almost more like assessments than it would be a design session. So the student does a presentation and the tutor gives feedback. I don't have time to talk about that now, but I wrote a paper and I can share some information about what actually happens in the crit in terms of how the tutor and the student navigate the kind of concrete, abstract, and the theoretical ideas, and how they weave between them, what actually happens in the crit. But it's almost like a presentation. It's not a lecture, but it's not a design session. It's a formative assessment. The students really want to get out of that crit. Where should they go to next, and what should they do next? So what is happening is, Froso called it the accidental encounters, serendipity. There's very little of that happening because it's time-based, it's scheduled, and it's quite formal. And for that purpose, one would then have to, in the blend, design opportunity for that serendipitous learning, that social accidental encounters to happen as well. Of course, accessibility is important. The fact that the webinars are recorded, students have access to all the material. The front row advantage that is being spoken about is not that critical here, because people can actually on the screen see exactly what the others are seeing. In that sense, they're not left behind. It focuses on the work. It links to the fact that it's quite formal. I'm just wrapping up with the last 2 points. Resource saving, in the sense that you don't have to drive around, you don't have to cart paper around. That is interesting. I don't know about time. I think people are discovering that through sitting online the whole day, they're actually spending more time. I don't know why that is the case. Somebody should research why we are actually, now that we're no longer commuting, we're using our commute time to also work and try and be productive. The last point is inclusive. The whole aspect of access and equity that we've spoken about already. we can link up in global studios. We can bring in experts. The online desk grid really helps us to create a platform for exposing students to real amazing people and experts. So just to conclude, it's really clear that the online desk grid is creating or presenting other things that we're not finding in a face-to-face situation, and conversely, there are things that we cannot duplicate in an online space. And in moving forward into this unsure future, let's talk about how can we navigate these different spaces, and how can we negotiate them in a fluid manner that we can acknowledge them, and we're not having to go into one space and out of another, but we can merge them successfully. Thank you very much for your time and for listening.
Fantastic. Thank you, Yolanda. I'll ask you to stop sharing. There you go. And can I ask all the panelists to turn on their videos and audio? And I'd like to just again thank them all once more for their fantastic talks. It was, I think, the wildest range of topics that I've had in 1 hour, to be honest. So I'll open the floor for questions. So if anyone has any question, please do type it into the portal. We already have one question to Dave. And Dave, the question is, did students expect or know they would have to purchase tools before the semester started, or did this happen only after the switch to at-home making?
Yeah, I saw that's from Don. Thanks very much, Don. Good to see your name there. I hope you're doing well. In our case, we were incredibly lucky. We had just...
Oops, you paused.
Before we got shut down. Did I pause? Or did...
No, you're good.
Oh, good. Yeah, the week before we got shut down, we'd sent everyone off to Bunnings to buy their saw, their miter box, and their timber. So in that sense, those who followed the rules directly, or the guidance, were all in good shape. Having said that, as I said, we did say they should have 3 meters of timber. Lots of students tried to buy half that and see if they'd get away with it. And so we had a huge number run out halfway through. And so we, in this case, we had to adopt a digital version. So they were modeling in 3D in Rhino, basically, instead of doing physical iterations. And in fact, we made all students do at least 1 iteration digitally, but those students who'd run out of material, then we had to give them a backup option, which was to keep going. And it's worth saying now, we just started another project, which is a kind of generative drawing or a kind of material behavior privileging drawing project. And basically we're expecting everyone to raid their pantries and their local supermarkets. So we're probably going to have soy sauce and vinegar more than we're going to have paint or ink, or actually could work out really, really well. I think some more expansive ideas of what mediums we might work with.
Great. So we have a few more questions coming in. Frosso and David, if you have online crits or discussions, do students share work and you discuss it, or what do these sessions revolve around in terms of the development of the students' work? So maybe Frosso, if you would take this one.
Sure. Well, do I do anything?
No, we can hear you. Go ahead.
Yeah, we're all fine.
Yeah.
Well, actually, I enjoyed the other two, both guys, Yolanda and Dave. Amazing. I love Yolanda. Sorry, you have to wait for the question now to answer. And I love Yolanda's desk, the critic moves, and the actual kid stays on the thing. That's amazing. And it's a really beautiful stepping stone towards our lives now. Believe it or not, we cannot sleep. Me and my co-director, we can't sleep because the first crits, guys, are going to be in 2 weeks. It's the first crits of the first year. First time they're designing a building. So we are freaking out how this is going to happen, because the answer is, I do not know. And I dread, if you've done it before, you can simulate, you can think, that section means that thing. But this idea of not being able to multitask, this idea of the simultaneity, imagine an orchestra conductor, first listening to violin, then go to the other room, listening to viola, then to the tambourine or whatever. So it is, okay, I'm not sure. In terms of presentation, I'm sure it's going to be great, and you have very good tools, the other two presenters. But I don't know. I think we have to be realistic. I think for first-year students that haven't done it before, it's going to be deprived of the ingenuity of not only, as Dave said, turning it upside down, but just, you know, this optimism of you've done something, 3/4 of what you've done is irrelevant, focus on that. So this cannot be the same, let's face it. So these kids would have to wait for other occasions of unlocking themselves from the lockdown and then working in practices, connecting with other occasions. We have to be realistic. It will not be the same in terms of possibilities. Yeah, it will be fine, but it won't be the same.
Dave, do you want to add anything to that?
I completely agree that the big challenge, before we were in lockdown, I would quite often have students do a kind of more like a sequential PowerPoint presentation, which forces them to read and make an argument, and that we can really see how they've structured the argument. But I always, we normally did it in studio with a rolling big screen with that on, and then the drawings are next door. And if you don't have the drawings next door, which is what happens online, it becomes incredibly difficult because you're 100% burdened to stick to the student's narrative, which especially in first year is not so perfectly resolved. And of course, as Frosta says, it's like you want to see the section when they're talking to you about some other aspect, or look at 3 drawings at the same time, and it's very difficult.
So a question for Yolanda. Yolanda, do you feel that the remote online blended learning studio has prepared your students for this current pandemic and new way of working? Many architectural practices are currently working remotely, and many employees are having problems adapting to this new way of working.
Yes, I think, thank you for that question. I think to a large extent we've been prepared, I would say technologically. I think we could never have foreseen the emotional impact that it has on our students. And the fact that our students also, on this program, we rely on the students' workplace to support them during their studies. And those students who had now gone home to the remote areas are not necessarily connected in the same way. They don't have the equipment. So we are having to deal with students in regards to their personal circumstances.
Great. A short question, I think, for Dave from Santiago Perez. What is the largest class size that you anticipate for the remote robotics formats?
At the moment, UTS is basically running at 20. It used to be the maximum. Of course, the economic impact of COVID means it will for sure be the minimum. I think in robotics, we'll be able to keep it to both the minimum and the maximum. And we'll, at that stage, we'll be using students in, for sure, pairs, so possibly more than that in terms of the actual production. And then, yeah, we're going to have to see how we go. But that's realistically what's going to happen.
For Frosso, it's quite of a long comment. I'll let you read that because it's very nice. I don't want to make you blush. But the question is, in what ways, it's in the chat box. In what ways?
I'm not chat box, so
it's okay. Don't worry. It's all right. Okay, I'll read it out.
No, don't read it out.
Okay. In what ways do you envisage replicating the extraordinary in a digital realm? So we can manage. So the question is that we seem to be managing the ordinary, okay, but how do you envisage replicating the extraordinary?
Right. Like I'll question first the question now. What does he or she mean with the ordinary and the extraordinary? Do they mean it? Because that's a very interesting question. What does he mean or she? The extraordinary, the ordinary, in terms of design, or in terms of studying, or just to clarify?
Well, let's say until Joel clarifies. Let's say in terms of design.
So how do we achieve the extraordinary or the ordinary?
In the digital realm. How do we achieve the extraordinary in the digital realm?
Right. Well, then we need to define what we mean by ordinary. I always have this motto: to design and build an intelligent toilet is more difficult than doing a museum, you know, much more. To design the ordinary, the everyday, in a very extraordinary way, it's my joy, you know. So what I think this lockdown will teach us is, for example, how many times, again, I refer to the example, the banality of opening your window and looking outwards, which is called the facade. I live in a forest, 1930s block. I don't have a balcony. So I slide the window to look out. In the future lockdowns, which are sadly, I think we're going to have, the whole issue of the city and you come on the facade. So this banality of the ordinary, of the wall dividing the skin of inside to out, becomes an amazing, extraordinary phenomenon. Or the rooftop. So in a way, how do you deal? It's sort of little details of life, like the plumbing, the facade. What is the roof terraces in a city? How do we bring food around? How do we, all that have to be dealt with. You need to be much more clever to deal with the banalities and the ordinary. But quality of design advice, you cannot do everything through the thing. So you need more, you can, but you need, if a normal tutorial takes half an hour, then a normal tutorial now would take at least an hour, at least. It does take. Well, it's just very painful. Yeah.
That kind of brings me back to Yolanda's request for research into this. I actually think it's a very, very interesting thing to look into. Actually, Yolanda, there's another question here for you. Can you please elaborate on where you think we can improve our facilitation of online crits and how we can better try to simulate the humanity of face-to-face experiences? Do you have any tips and tricks to share?
Yes, I'm reading up. I'm interested in social presence and how we can build on relationships. I think that online we have need to watch what we say and our tone of voice. Something that I didn't mention was that you can't always pick up on facial cues, on gestures, especially when you're not using the webcam. So we will have to show empathy, especially in the pandemic. I think it's kind of double as important. But there are ways in which how we communicate and how we respond to people. We must be aware of the fact that because they're not in the same space, they can't pick up on the nuances and they could interpret things in a way that we didn't intend it to be. So I don't have the answers, but I'm really interested in how you build those relationships online in a meaningful way.
One more question for Dave, and maybe we'll just take one or two more and then we'll start to sign off. So Dave, the question is, for some of the reviews, we've had students presenting via Zoom and controlling their narrative and images, but as well, we could review their work via the MIRO, and therefore anyone reviewing or joining in could review in quite close detail the different images, drawings, photos, etc. of each student, so that we could then ask questions about a specific drawing or part of drawing. Have you used this multi-platform review?
Yeah, I mean, yes, we're experimenting with concept board, Miro, Prezi, etc. These kinds of situations. We like them. Interestingly, I mean, they hit their limits. Once you have a lot of images and 20 people trying to have their work all in one space, it's a fantastic idea, but so far we're struggling, and especially concept board seems to load the images in the very weird order. It doesn't seem to pay attention to where you're looking in terms of what it chooses to render at one time. But I think that is definitely the sort of strategy, or even that we've printed drawings, or I have two laptops, so sometimes I'll have one that I can be on their Behance page and looking at the work at my own pace while I'm looking through the share screen at them. In a way, we kind of just need more and more screens. We want to see the faces. Of course, you always want to see the other jurors and what their facial expressions are showing. You want to see looking across the multiple drawings. And ideally, I mean, the thing we miss, I guess, is that we can see big drawings and really assess the arm weights and the quality and these things about the craft of drawing process.
Am I allowed to ask a question?
Yes, but I have a final question for you. So you ask and then I'll ask.
God.
Go for it. Okay. So actually, this is related to the last question I asked you about ordinary and extraordinary, and I'm glad Joel clarified this because I really want to hear your point of view. Part of the specifically architectural studio culture is all of the fun that the students have outside of studio. Whether that was in extracurricular activities, whether that was in time alone. So Joel clarified that what he meant by ordinary was the day-to-day teaching, but by extraordinary is the events and the exhibitions where people start to drink and go overboard. Yeah. So what do you think?
How this will go ahead? Yes.
How do we preserve the extraordinary in an online world?
Yeah. Very good. Okay, Joel, now I get it. Anyway, we talked about different things, but we all connect. Yeah, very good. And the problem at the moment is we've got so many extra, right? So the real extraordinary in terms of meeting and all that, physically, the tactile nature of it, the touching of something, or the being there won't happen. But there are so many things bombarding us. Like normally, I don't talk to anyone at home. I come midnight and I relax and I leave and I leave in the morning. So the connectivity now, you almost feel that the world is invading your bedroom, your room. So in that metaphor, I just think that the extraordinary, there is much more diversity, but also availability. So people who can't afford money-wise or time to travel, they can see any lecture. There is so many online studios and films and debates. So that's not the extraordinary. Good point. So I think a bit of hope here. I think that what we didn't discuss today, all of us stayed with the studio culture in terms of a tool to make you an architect. How do you operate? Amazing. And also Dave is lucky because, fabrication, you managed to make beautifully existing, outside the workshop. But I think for us, it's time that we revolt a little bit. We say, what is the original purpose of an architect? Some friend told me that, it was sort of in a public session he had, that in the 60s, it was like 70%, I might be wrong, 80% of architects were employed by the state, by the public sector. Now, the 80 or 70% is 0.7. So from the 70s onwards, the privatization, there's no social duty. We feel we can find someone, right, I built something. There is no duty of connecting to the system, whether it's community. So now it might be because we lose this extraordinary studio stuff or whatever, we could go out there, we could outreach and go to local councils and government and neighborhoods and say, I'm an architect, I could help you make a better school, make better teaching, or so somehow go back to originally what the architect, not a graphic architect. If you go to all the schools, including ours, they praise themselves. I don't. That's why I stick to the first year. But they praise amazing shows. What is a show? A show is a tool to sell yourself. But, it's an amazing resource of talent on the graphic. But I don't know the resilience and the adaptability of this. Hopefully it will be. But I think these difficult times, the fact that we don't taste physically the extraordinary should push us to go out there and then try to make a real difference. The problem is the students now, sadly, and us, we need better tutors, and the students, it's really tough for them because in a way they need a foundation course, metaphorically and literally. So while they start studying, they need also to train their maturity, which is an autonomy, very difficult. From schooling that tells you, hey, unless you get the bloody marks, you will not do anything. And parents pushing, you can't have this relaxed, let's go and sweep roads, make a boat, go and feed the koalas or whatever for a year, mature, earn some money, then go and study. So in a way, it's tough for the young kids, but long term, it might be better for them.
Fantastic. Well, I think on that note, and keeping in mind that we are only 20 minutes over schedule, which is, I think, an accomplishment for any architectural event, I would again once again like to thank the tremendous speakers and tremendous input and expertise that they have shed on this very important topic. So again, Yolanda from Cape Town, Dave from Sydney, and Frosso from London, thank you so much for your time and for your expertise. And we look forward to see you very, very soon. And thanks for all the attendees for attending. We will share the recording, and once it's online, we will send all attendees an email. So thank you again.
Take care.
Have a good day. See you later. Goodbye, everyone.
Thank you. Thanks for coming.
Bye-bye. Bye.
Bye.